Hablamos hoy sobre el distrito de Zacatecas y cambiamos a inglés. Just a disclaimer slide. And today we're going to be talking a bit more about the larger Zacatecas District. In the past, we focused very much on the San Nicasio project and the San Nicasio resource area. But we're going to step out a bit into the district, think about what have we learned by working in this world-class historic silver district, and how are we going to apply that and how are we applying that to other target areas in the district. To orient ourselves, we are located in the Zacatecas District, which is a district that was quote-unquote discovered in 1546 by Juan de Tolosa. However, the indigenous were mining it at this time. It is sort of, for me, very much in the central highlands of Mexico, just to the east of this large felsic igneous province here. It sits at a triple point between three different terrains, and for me, clearly that's one of the reasons why this is a prospective district for continued discovery in world-class systems. A bit of context in terms of where is this in the greater picture. One of the things that is fairly clear when you look at the large-scale stratigraphy of the area is that this block here that includes Fresnillo, Zacatecas, and to some degree Guanajuato down here is part of a crustal block that has a somewhat distinct history to these areas that are more to the north that we've heard quite a bit about today. One of the things that's going to become important is some of the stratigraphy that seems to be missing at surface. Here we have a very compressed stratigraphic package. We have this basement unit, which is Triassic rocks that are the basement to the Jurassic Cretaceous arc, the Guerrero terrain arcs that are the hosts to these deposits. We have the Chilitos Formation, which is part of that arc. And then we have just some very scattered outcrops of some of the younger stratigraphy in this large carbonate-dominated basin. However, in the subsurface, there do appear to be some other important units sitting below here. So just to zoom into the area a bit, the project that we historically discussed is here in San Nicasio. There is an existing resource of 16.9 million ounces of silver. We are in the process of updating that resource little by little. We've done a substantial amount of drilling since 2014, since that has been published, and we're excited when we get to that point to be able to share with you what we've been doing. Is that good? Yeah. All right. In the last year or two, we've also drilled at the Lucita project, which is here, which contains the Palenque vein and several other veins, but mainly the Palenque vein system. We had some good initial results from that area. We also drilled here just in the south in a vein called Tajores, and in the hanging wall splay of that vein, we hit about 3 kilos of silver. So we're quite keen to get a bit deeper into the main vein system because we drilled the main vein structure, but there was a lot of high-level alteration. And so hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be able to return and drill that system a bit deeper. And one of the projects that we'll spend a fair bit of time later in the presentation talking about is PANUCO. We have successfully now signed an agreement with the Ejido for this area, and we have begun surface work. We have a team mapping as we speak. We've done a preliminary mapping program. There is a little bit of historical drilling done by Pan American and some historical sampling, which are encouraging, which is why we decided to pick up this ground. But also in our work there, we have discovered some things that perhaps were previously overlooked and are to us very interesting. The creator of many of these figures is possibly sitting in this room, so thank you. Just in terms of an overview about where we are in a bit more detail, this is the edge of this felsic large igneous province, Sierra Madre here. Kind of sits right at the edge of that. And a lot of the areas around the main exposed blocks are covered by basin and range sediments. But as we know, there are in fact deposits out in this area, including Francisco y Madero, and an exploration potential in that vein as well. We currently now hold a large portion of the exposed district, or the known district, in Zacatecas. About half of the area One of the things that I think has really been fantastic about working here is that this is a district that has historically been mainly explored using historic methods and very traditional geoscience. And one of the things that we've been doing slowly but surely over the last several years is really collecting modern geoscience data sets, doing oriented core drilling, getting the modeling just right, really understanding what are the orientations of the structures that carry mineralization, what are the orientations of other controlling structures, and really beginning to flesh out our understanding of what are the controls on mineralization and what areas are most likely to contain significant mineralization in this district. In terms of a bit of an overview, we've heard a bit about deposits in this area, but just to kind of set the stage, this is hosted in the Guro composite terrain, which is mainly a Jurassic Cretaceous island arc that was accreted to the sort of proto-Mexican continent. And the mineralization here really, with the exception of San Nicolas, which is early and sort of more related to the arc itself, this later mineralization really gets started around 50 million years ago, and sort of between 50 and 40, there is significant mineralization that is more in the style of intermediate sulfidation systems that are sort of classic here in Mexico, that are sort of silver, zinc, or silver, lead, zinc dominant. And there is also a later pulse of mineralization in this district, which is exemplified at the El Arito mine. And it's a 29, 30 million year old, more gold dominant, for me, more low sulfidation flavored system. Mainly what we have on our project areas is this sort of older system that has a much more intermediate sulfidation flavor to it. One of the things that's actually quite cool, this is a photo of the Purísima tunnel entrance, which is one of the main portals at the San Nicasio mine. I think this is from either the late 1800s or early 1900s. What you can't see is there's actually another photo that I recently found on the internet. And over here, there is a huge patio where they were doing actually quite a lot of processing and sorting of the ore. What we have learned over the last several years, and some of these have been anecdotal things in the district, but now we're beginning to be able to actually see them in the rocks and see them in the data. And clearly, one of the very important things is what type of juice is there. There's a lot of zones of really wide vein widths that have barren material. And so it's really important to understand which phases are carrying the mineralization and sort of what is perhaps the control on the locations of those, not only sulfide phases, but sulfide phases with grade. And the other thing that has become very clear from a lot of the surface mapping, digitization of the historic underground data, and all of the oriented core data collection that we have been doing in conjunction with Chris Brown and his team at OTS, is that there are very, very strong secondary structural controls. And we've been able to begin mapping those out, planning drill holes based on those, and really starting to understand where and what is controlling those ore chutes. Because there is definitely portions of the system, you can easily hit the structure, but it's much more tricky to hit the zones with the high grade. But we are getting much better at that, and it's been really fantastic to see that play out in vivo, if you will. The other thing that has become apparent is that we need to understand the stratigraphy of this district better. One, to understand any type of block changes or sort of level changes across the system, but also to target more prospective horizons for replacement style deposits, and to understand kind of where we are in that strat package. The last thing that's become fairly obvious for us, and there are exceptions, but more or less, there seems to be a very strong control on the width and quality of the veining or brecciation and the quality of the mineralization based on the host rock. The pillow basalts tend to be the best host. They break really well. They are just very favorable for the mineralization. Things that are called andesites but are also quite basaltic, those also are decent. The sediments, they're okay. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. But the thing that is typically a really bad sign, and that's really an issue, is when there are intrusives where you anticipate the vein to be. For the most part, we see them in the footwall, which is a good thing, but any place where we have them sort of encroaching into that structural zone, you can see that the fluids have passed through there, but very rare, and sometimes there's decent alteration, but very rarely are there sort of any significant wisps of veining or material that was added to the rock. So in the middle here, this is one of our gabbros, and there's a gabbro diorite, and we've also encountered some probably much older ultramafic rocks, which is very interesting. They have not been mapped in this area, but we found them originally through the geochem, actually. We're like, what are these ultramafic looking things? Well, they're ultramafic rocks. But in any case, all of the intrusive rocks are not as favorable in terms of host for the veins. Recently, we have done a fantastic program where we pulled all of the vein intercepts that we drilled within the resource area, laid them all out on the ground together, and did a campaign of relogging, trying to understand where is the main structure, what are the contexts of the main structure, what is the host rock, what are the different phases of mineralization. And Stephanie Sikora and Aaron Garcia and Leti Figueroa have been working on going through all of the vein intercepts and making a log of where we have which phases. And some of the things that we have learned is that, okay, contrary to popular belief, the amethyst here is early. And there is sort of an early barren phase. The green lightning bolts are good. Those are the phases that carry usually spectacular mineralization, particularly silver dominant mineralization. And then sort of following this sort of amethyst phase, there's a really sulfide-rich phase. And it kind of starts off with really light honey-colored sphalerite and significant silver sulfide. That's where the silver grade is best, and it seems to evolve through sort of a series of fluid changes to being much more pyritic, much more iron-rich, having much darker sort of red or coffee-colored sphalerite. Some of these phases contain galena, and that's almost always argentiferous galena. And we're sort of in the process of sort of teasing out what is the relationship between these events here, but they are all of interest, and particularly this phase here. It's not always mineralized, but when it is strongly zinc and gold mineralized. And we have this phase here, which is very calcite rich. It's often silver rich. And we've mostly seen it shallow in the resource area, but we've been doing some additional drilling to sort of step out from there and understand what are the controls on that, and are there other structures that carry that mineralization. There are a couple of later phases that tend to dilute the mineralization, which is not ideal, but there's very suspiciously a lot of interestingly textured dolomite or carbonate veins deep in the system, and a number of people have suggested that we should think about what that means. The other thing that we've learned is that not all breccias are the right breccias. There's substantial sort of hydrothermal or cement dominant breccias, but there are also these more sort of milled or matrix-rich breccias that actually represent faults that cut through the system. Most of these faults, particularly these two bottom ones, are sort of more north-south-ish cross structures that exert some control over the location of the chutes and the edges of the chutes. They also sometimes seem to displace portions of the chute. This iron carbonate tends to be associated sometimes in sort of vein splays, but also in shallow or like more low angle faults in the system. And this really dark black milled breccia is typically almost always inside or sort of within the zone of the Veta Grande and subparallel to that structure. This is a very cartoon slide because we're not quite at a place where we are happy to share all of our information about what we are learning about the structural architecture. But the general picture really is that the red thing's the vein / the large Veta Grande structure where it's solid it is much better mineralized. As the vein structure moves to the east, it becomes much wider, less defined, and in some cases it looks like they were sort of higher up in what could be a continuation of the system. The other thing that's really important, and they're not super easy to see, but there's these sort of oblique structures that come in the footwall, and this also happens at depth at the structure. So you can see it mapped out in some of the historic underground mapping, and these structures seem to be kind of almost pointing you to where you have zones of dilation in the vein system. And then these kind of like north-south-ish structures are some of the ones that are represented by those breccias that we spoke about in the last slide. And some of them aren't so important, but almost always one of them in each of these packets of sort of zones of faulting is really critical to controlling the edge of the chute. This is a slide that Chris helped us put together. I just wanted to show, like, really what does the data actually look like? What are we doing with this data? This is all really detailed, meticulous data collection that has been done by our team of geos. They've done a fantastic job. Marte Hodin is somewhere in this room. He's been doing, right there, he's been doing most of the structural data collection, a spectacular job of it, and really focusing on what structures are important and collecting data that matters and keeping sort of the mess to a minimum. And what we've started to see is that you can actually, obviously, connect what you see at surface, what you see in the drilling, and what's been historically mapped underground, particularly as we can't access most of the levels right now. One of the things that you can see is sort of this structure right in here. These are these structures that tend to be of great importance, have a control over what is the edge of the chute, and we're starting to be able to really map those out in 3D with the data that we have been collecting and digitizing. So in terms of the stratigraphy, I think historically the understanding is that in the sort of the Zacatecas block, it is a compressed sequence, but that also there's a lot of missing stratigraphy here. And that is true. And sort of in terms of mostly what you see is this sort of basement block, which is sort of before this Chilitos arc package. This is much shallower and nearer to the Cosamine deposit that is also in the district that's currently being mined. This package here, this kind of Chilitos package, particularly is very strongly volcaniclastic, and with some packages of sediment. And the thing that we are starting to understand, because we now have a good sequence of mapping and all over the whole land package, is what is the stratigraphy in this area. This section here is from the Las Pilas area, and it's similar, but not exactly the same as what we have in Zacatecas. And with all of the drill data, we are getting a much better handle on what does that stratigraphy look like for us, what are the better units to target in terms of host rock for the vein, or the host rock for the vein systems, and what are the relationships between the different areas of the project and the stratigraphy. One of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is what's going on down here. And if you had a magnifying glass, you'd be able to read in here that some portions of the Chilitos have more carbonate material. Historically, this has not been the case in the outcropping Zacatecas block, but we know that Francisco y Madero does exist. Debatable exactly where that is in the section, but it's below the Chilitos, and it is really carbonate rich. And what we're starting to see is that some of the rocks, perhaps deeper in the sequence, deeper in the stratigraphy, do have a more carbonate rich flavor. This is my interpretation of the limited information that I have and understand about Francisco y Madero. For me, when I look at this, I see two conglomerates, probably marking unconformities. This is some type of Triassic or potentially even older basement. These rocks are actually quite metamorphosed, unlike the Triassic basement on the main Zacatecas block, which is weakly to moderately metamorphosed. Then you have this package of rocks that is the host to the mineralization here, in my understanding. What I have read is that this was ground prepped by a broadly laramide age intrusion that sort of scarnified but without metals. or without strong grade, different beds within the sequence of more limey rocks, and then later the fluids ingressed and replaced that scarnification minerals with metals. At least that's what I have read. And then the thing I noticed here that was very suspicious to me is another conglomerate that looks like an unconformity surface to me, and that perhaps this package of rocks here that's sort of blown out, this is all pillow lavas, and then sort of down here, there are things that are noted to be much more carbonate rich, maybe dirty carbonates, that type of thing. And that's the rocks that we believe we're starting to see in the northern part of the project. So these are some of the strat sections that we put together for our project. This is for the more of the main San Nicasio and Lucita area. And there is these pillow lavas up here are the ones that are a spectacular host to the Vita Grande system. And there are sort of multiple intrusions of mafic, ultramafic, and sort of intermediate that cross-cut the system. We have an age date for the diorite. We're ever so patiently awaiting our bedelliite age date for the gabbro. It's been about a year. We're very hopeful it'll come back soon. And just to kind of understand that a bit better, but mostly what you see here is that you have a package of pillow lavas that have been later intruded by sort of andesites or basaltic andesites. And then you have a package of interbedded sediments and basaltic andesites. But there are not pillow lavas interbedded with sediments at surface in this area. We recently drilled a deep pool in the eastern portion of the San Nicasio property that does have interbedded sediments and pillow basalts. And that's very interesting because at PANUCO, which is in the far north and is one of our sort of best and more interesting targets, what we see is that we have this section of pillow basalts, we have sediments, and then we have interbedded pillow basalts and limey siltstones. And some of the rocks there's a lot of carbonate material floating around. There are textures that look like replacement and some of these historic workings. And so we are encouraged, as that this is that surface in PANUCO, that we're getting into even more favorable host rocks there. So kind of just a brief intro to the PANUCO portion of the property. This is part of the land package that we are acquiring from Pan American Silver. And they did a bit of drilling here in the past and sort of some mapping campaigns. The zone that we're particularly focused on and interested in right now has not been drilled. It's here in this sort of what's labeled as the Tres Cruces vein system. And we started looking at some of the historic surface sampling, and this zone is anomalous in almost every metal. Silver, copper, lead, zinc, gold, moly. It is a huge target in terms of the geochem, and it appears to be sort of a vein swarm or intersection of veins. And all of this is just sitting at surface. And so we have a team out there mapping now. We've done one sort of first pass map, and we're really encouraged by what we've seen there. And we'll be working towards getting a drill permit and hopefully putting some holes into this thing later on in this year or early next year. This is sort of the preliminary map with some of the vein details not well displayed. But the two main zones that we're focused on are the GLORIA zone and the AURORA zone. And at surface, what you have here is kind of the upper pillow basalt, and here is more of the lower pillow basalt, but you can see pieces of this at surface from the shafts that have been previously mined here. So in the AURORA zone, which is this zone down here, it sort of looks to be a bit more shallowly exposed. And there's a substantial amount of carbonate material, banded, cockade textured, spectacular rocks, very kind of high level in appearance, and very sort of oxide rich at this time. But these are really distinctive looking vein or vein breccias that we also see in a newly mapped zone north of the Vita Grande and the San Nicasio property. So these sort of carbonate or iron carbonate dominated expressions of the vein system, we've started to find these in a number of areas on the property, and they are associated with elevated grade and historic workings. And so these are, we're in the process of getting additional drill permits, and these things we will be following up on in the next months. For me, the most spectacular thing, if you want to see any of these vein stages, any of these breccia stages, any of these rocks from PANUCO, please come past our Korshak booth. For me, when I saw these rocks, I was like, I handed this rock to 3 different seasoned Mexican geologists, and every single one of them, looking at some of the hand specimens in person, said, this looks like a manto. Huh. And we had a discussion at this shaft where just was one of those strange discussions where someone was like, no, this is a vein. No, this is a replacement deposit. No, this could be a VMS. And I was like, whoa, 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 all right. This sounds a lot like the discussion around what we've sort of anecdotally heard about Francisco y Madero. Also for me, I've worked a lot in carbonate rocks. It's looking pretty carbonatey, but there's just, in terms of the grade, I think we're weighting acids on these things, but we've XRF'd them. And for me, the thing that's really encouraging is that we see this phase here, which this honey color is sphalerite. Where the sphalerite is yellow to almost white. There tend to be significant silver sulfides. We also see sort of this darker, almost banded, more iron-rich sphalerite as well. So for us, we're really excited about this zone. We can't wait to get a drill in there. And I just wanted to say thank you to our whole team and all of our collaborators, because this is absolutely a group effort. And thank you guys so much. Thanks Chris and the OTS team and Dante and Maricela, who had been doing most of our mapping for several years. We've had fantastic time working with Major Drilling and also OrQuest. Thank you guys all.